My name is Ava Carter, and 3 weeks ago my mother laughed in front of 30 people and asked whether I planned on becoming successful before 40, or if the family should finally accept that I wasted my life chasing internet documentaries. 12 hours later, my face was on every major local news station in the state. Reporters were parked outside my apartment building, and the same relatives who spent years introducing me like I was the embarrassing branch of the family tree suddenly started telling strangers they always knew I was talented. If you stay until the end, you'll understand why some families do not actually hate failure. They hate uncertainty. The moment the world validates you publicly, they rush to rewrite history because visible success matters more to them than the years they spent crushing you privately. And if you enjoy stories about betrayal, underestimated women, and people being forced to confront the person they mocked for years, subscribe and let me know what you would have done in my place. I grew up in a family where success was treated almost like a competitive sport. Everything became comparison material. Salaries, schools, promotions, houses, relationships. My uncle Victor built a successful real estate company during the housing boom years. And after that, the entire family started worshiping stability and money like they were proof of intelligence. My older brother Liam became the perfect example of what my parents respected. Finance degree, corporate job, expensive apartment before 30. Every family gathering somehow turned into another celebration of whichever relative looked most impressive professionally that year. Then there was me. While everyone else chased careers designed to sound good at dinner parties, I spent most of high school carrying around an old second-hand camera, filming small documentaries around the city. I loved real stories. Restaurant owners trying to survive rising rent. Factory workers losing jobs after plants closed. Women rebuilding their lives after abusive marriages. I liked finding the kinds of stories people with money usually ignore, because they never have to live inside them. My mother hated it immediately. In her mind, creative careers belonged to wealthy kids with safety nets, not middle-class daughters who needed to think realistically about survival. At first, the criticism sounded normal enough. Parents worry. They push stability. But over time, the tone changed from concern into embarrassment. Whenever relatives asked what I was doing with my life, my mother never called me a filmmaker or journalist. She would smile awkwardly and say Ava is still figuring things out right now in the same tone people use when discussing someone recovering from bad decisions. My father rarely insulted me directly, but his silence made things worse sometimes because it always felt like quiet agreement. The comparisons with Liam never stopped. Liam bought property at 28. Liam already has investment accounts. Liam understands responsibility. Meanwhile, I dropped out of college after struggling financially and started juggling freelance production gigs while working part-time at a warehouse to survive. Weddings, small business ads, social media clips, anything that paid enough to cover rent. Then, every night after work, I edited documentaries until 2 or 3 in the morning trying to build something meaningful online. Most of my videos barely reached a few thousand views, but occasionally, one would spread farther than expected. Those moments kept me alive emotionally because strangers connected with my work more deeply than my own family ever did. 3 years ago, I started investigating contamination issues in several dying industrial towns across the state after interviewing former factory workers in a place called Millfield. At first, I thought I was documenting economic collapse and unemployment, but during one interview, an older woman mentioned unusual illness patterns among workers handling chemical disposal decades earlier. The more people I interviewed, the stranger the stories became. Workers talked about hidden dumping sites, falsified reports, and supervisors warning employees to stay quiet about chemical exposure. Nobody had enough proof individually, but collectively, the stories formed something ugly. For almost 2 years, I investigated quietly while balancing warehouse shifts and freelance work. I filed public records requests, interviewed former employees, tracked environmental reports, and slowly built a timeline connecting multiple manufacturing companies to illegal chemical dumping practices dating back decades. The deeper I went, the more resistance I faced. One former worker backed out of an interview after someone from his old company contacted him the same night we spoke. Another source disappeared entirely after promising to hand over internal documents. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I was building something that mattered beyond money. My family treated it like a phase. At holidays, relatives joked about my YouTube detective career. My aunt once asked whether I planned on getting a real profession before my looks faded, because apparently women with unstable careers become invisible faster. Everybody laughed, including my mother. Over time, I stopped defending myself because I realized something painful. My family did not see me as temporarily unsuccessful. They saw failure as my identity. The worst night happened 3 weeks ago. My Uncle Victor hosted a huge family dinner, celebrating Liam's promotion into senior management at his investment firm, and the entire evening felt designed to remind me exactly where I ranked socially inside the family. Conversations revolved around salaries, real estate, and promotions. While I sat there quietly listening to people discuss lives they considered respectable. At some point during dessert, one of my cousins jokingly asked whether my documentaries had finally earned enough money for me to move out of my tiny apartment. Before I could answer, my mother laughed and said Ava's probably waiting for suffering to make her art more authentic before she starts paying rent properly. Everybody laughed. Again. Normally, I would have stayed quiet, because fighting back only makes families like mine treat you like you're emotionally unstable. But that night, something in me snapped. I told her maybe the difference between us was that I cared more about meaningful work than looking successful to people who never feel satisfied anyway. The room went silent instantly. My mother looked furious. She asked whether I genuinely thought my little internet videos compared to real careers, and before I could answer, she said the sentence I still hear in my head sometimes. She looked directly at me and said impact is what unsuccessful people say when they fail to make money. Nobody defended me. Not my father. Not Liam. Nobody. I left immediately after that. Around midnight, while driving home furious and humiliated, my phone started vibrating nonstop with notifications, but I ignored them because I assumed it was family drama. Then my best friend Nora called screaming loudly enough that I had to pull over near a gas station. A major regional news station had just aired a breaking story about industrial contamination tied to several manufacturing companies. And they were using my footage. At first, I genuinely thought Nora was exaggerating because independent creators get excited over tiny recognition all the time. I pulled into the gas station parking lot, opened my phone, and immediately saw my own face frozen beside a breaking headline about toxic dumping investigations connected to one of the largest manufacturing companies in the region. The station was airing clips from interviews I filmed in Millfield, while reporters discussed newly leaked internal documents proving environmental violations had been hidden for decades. For several seconds, I just stared at the screen because my brain could not process how quickly everything changed. Then I saw the credit line underneath the footage. Independent journalist Ava Carter. That word hit me harder than the news itself. Journalist. Not failed filmmaker. Not struggling content creator. Not my mother's favorite phrase. The girl still figuring things out. Journalist. Nora kept talking rapidly while I sat there trying to absorb what was happening. Apparently, a former compliance officer from one of the companies anonymously leaked internal environmental reports to several news organizations and directly referenced my documentary investigation in the process. Since I already spent years collecting interviews, documenting dumping sites, and building timelines, stations immediately started licensing my footage while trying to contact me for interviews and commentary. By the time I reached my apartment, my inbox looked unreal. Journalists, producers, environmental lawyers, podcast requests, even 2 documentary distributors asking whether I owned full rights to the footage. Then my phone rang again. My mother. I almost ignored it, but curiosity won. The second I answered, her voice sounded completely different from the woman sitting across the dinner table 3 hours earlier. Suddenly, she sounded emotional, overwhelmed, almost proud. She asked why I never told the family your work was becoming this serious, which nearly made me laugh because I spent years trying to explain exactly that while everyone treated me like a delusional woman with a camera. Then she admitted relatives were already discussing the story in the family group chat, and Uncle Victor wanted to know whether I was personally involved in the investigation or if the station simply bought random footage from me. That question told me everything. Even now, they still hoped I accidentally stood near success instead of creating it. I told my mother yes, the investigation was heavily connected to my reporting and interviews, and for several seconds she stayed quiet. Then, suddenly, her tone softened into the same voice she uses whenever speaking to outsiders she wants to impress. She told me she always knew I was talented, and that maybe the family simply misunderstood what I was building. Hearing that less than 3 hours after she publicly humiliated me almost made me sick. It was my first real experience watching someone rewrite history in real time, because public opinion suddenly changed the social value of my work. The next morning was complete chaos. By 8 a.m., reporters were waiting outside my apartment building, asking for interviews. My subscriber count exploded overnight. One of my documentary uploads crossed 2 million views in less than 12 hours because larger creators started reacting publicly to the investigation. Former factory workers I interviewed years earlier began contacting me again because the story finally felt visible enough for them to speak safely. Once national attention arrives, silence becomes harder to maintain. Then the biggest shock came. One of the manufacturing subsidiaries connected to the contamination case had indirect business ties to my Uncle Victor's commercial real estate company from years earlier. Nothing criminal from what anyone understood yet, but suddenly, the same investigation making me famous also threatened to embarrass someone my family actually respected. That changed the family atmosphere instantly. Around noon, Liam called me for the first time in almost 5 months. At first, he acted supportive, congratulating me and saying he always knew I would eventually make something happen creatively. That irritated me immediately, because Liam spent years staying silent while the rest of the family treated me like an embarrassment. But eventually, the real reason for the call surfaced. He wanted to know how deeply the investigation might affect Uncle Victor's business reputation if reporters started digging through old partnerships publicly. There it was again. Even during the biggest moment of my life, the family priority remained reputation management. I told Liam investigators would determine responsibility independently if companies were involved, and he immediately became defensive. Then he said something that permanently changed how I viewed him. He told me public attention disappears quickly, but damaged reputations inside a family last forever. That sentence stayed in my head all day because it perfectly explained how my family thinks. Reputation matters more than truth. Always. By evening, the story spread nationally. One former employee I interviewed agreed to appear publicly with me during a televised segment, and once his testimony aired, several more workers came forward describing years of concealed contamination and internal cover-ups. State investigators confirmed multiple industrial sites were now under emergency review, and suddenly, my documentary footage stopped being internet content and started becoming evidence. Then my landlord knocked on my apartment door. Not because of complaints, because reporters were crowding outside the building, asking neighbors whether they knew the journalist exposing the contamination scandal. The entire thing felt unreal. Less than 24 hours earlier, my family laughed at me during dinner. Now national media outlets were discussing my investigation, while environmental attorneys referenced my reporting publicly. But strangely, the attention itself was not the most satisfying part. The satisfying part was watching people who spent years dismissing me suddenly become careful with their words. That night, my father called. Not texted. Called. My father rarely called me first unless something serious happened, so hearing his voice immediately felt strange. He sounded uncomfortable, almost cautious, like he was suddenly speaking to someone whose social value changed overnight, and he had not emotionally adjusted yet. He told me he watched the interviews and admitted the investigation looked important. Then he apologized indirectly for how dinner went the previous night. Not fully, just enough to protect his pride, while acknowledging the situation shifted. Then he asked whether I planned on discussing the family publicly during interviews. That question disappointed me more than anything else because it confirmed exactly what I already suspected. My success did not make them reflective. It made them nervous. I told him I had no interest in humiliating the family publicly because, unlike some people, I do not use embarrassment as entertainment. He went quiet after that. Then he admitted something I never expected to hear from him. He said your mother spent years being afraid you would fail publicly because she thought it would reflect badly on the family. But now she's afraid you'll succeed publicly and remember how everyone treated you first. That was the closest thing to honesty anyone in my family had given me in years. 2 days later, everything exploded again. Federal investigators officially joined the case, and a national streaming platform announced the release of my full documentary series. The moment the streaming platform announced the documentary release, my entire life stopped feeling private. Until then, the story still felt regional enough that I could emotionally separate my normal life from the investigation. That disappeared overnight. National media outlets began discussing the contamination case constantly. My interviews spread across social media faster than I could process them, and suddenly millions of strangers knew my face, while my own family struggled to understand how the daughter they mocked for years became the center of one of the largest environmental scandals in the country. The documentary premiered 4 nights later. I watched it alone in my apartment because, despite all the public attention, part of me still felt emotionally disconnected from everything happening. For years, the project existed mostly in exhaustion and uncertainty. Warehouse shifts during the day, editing until 3 in the morning, driving hours to interview former workers nobody else cared enough to listen to. Now executives, reporters, and politicians were discussing the exact footage my family once called a waste of time. The reaction exploded immediately. Former factory employees started coming forward publicly after watching the series. Families from multiple towns contacted investigative reporters describing illness patterns that matched what workers warned about years earlier. Environmental lawyers announced class action investigations. Within 48 hours, 2 senior executives connected to the manufacturing companies resigned publicly after internal documents surfaced proving management knew contamination risks existed for decades. Then came the interview that changed everything personally. A major national talk show invited me on for a live segment discussing the investigation, the documentary, and the years I spent building the story independently. During the interview, the host asked how it felt spending years being dismissed while pursuing work that eventually became nationally important. At first, I answered professionally about persistence and investigative journalism, but then something shifted emotionally while I was talking. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe honesty just finally outweighed caution. Either way, I stopped giving polished answers. I admitted the hardest part was never financial instability or uncertainty. The hardest part was being surrounded constantly by people who treated visible success as the only proof your work deserved respect. Then, I said something that spread online almost instantly afterward. I said some families only believe in you after strangers do first. That clip exploded everywhere. Millions of views within hours. Thousands of comments from people describing parents who mocked creative careers, relatives who only respected money, and families who rewrote history after success became visible publicly. Suddenly, the story stopped being only about environmental corruption. It became personal for people, because apparently, a huge number of families operate exactly the same way mine did. That was when my mother completely lost control of the narrative. One of my cousins leaked screenshots from old family group chats where relatives mocked my career for years. Jokes about me staying broke forever. Comments about me embarrassing the family. Messages from my mother complaining that explaining my internet documentaries to her friends felt humiliating. Once those screenshots spread online beside clips from my interview, the entire public conversation shifted toward how families treat daughters chasing unconventional careers before success becomes socially impressive. My mother called me crying the next morning, not because she regretted what she said, because strangers online were criticizing her. That distinction mattered deeply. She kept insisting the family always loved me and only wanted stability for me. But by then, I understood something clearly. Concern and humiliation are not the same thing. My family did not simply fear I would struggle financially. They lowered my value, constantly, because my life embarrassed their idea of success. Then my father surprised me. Later that night, he came to my apartment carrying an old cardboard storage box I had not seen in years. Inside were mini DV tapes, photographs, notebooks, and hard drives containing my earliest documentary projects from high school. I thought most of them disappeared during one of our family moves. My father sat quietly on the couch for a while before admitting he secretly kept everything because despite staying silent publicly, he never actually believed I lacked talent. He just thought the world would destroy me before talent mattered enough to save me. That confession hurt almost more than open criticism. Not because it was cruel, because it was passive. He watched me get humiliated for years while privately believing I mattered, and somehow that silence felt heavier than insults. Before leaving, he told me something I still think about constantly. He said your mother and the rest of the family respected certainty more than passion because certainty feels safer. But people who change things usually look irresponsible right before they succeed. 3 weeks after my mother mocked me at that family dinner, I stood outside a federal courthouse while investigators announced formal criminal charges connected to the contamination case. Reporters crowded around asking questions while cameras followed every movement, and somewhere behind the media crowd, I noticed my family standing together quietly watching me. My mother looked emotional. Liam looked uncomfortable. Uncle Victor looked irritated because his business connections kept appearing in articles discussing proximity to the investigation. For years, these people introduced me like I was a warning. Now, strangers introduced me as the journalist who exposed one of the largest environmental cover-ups in the region. And honestly, the success itself was never the most satisfying part. The satisfying part was finally understanding that their opinion of me was never connected to my actual worth. It was connected to whether my life made sense inside their worldview. The moment strangers validated my work publicly, they rushed to rewrite history because people obsessed with status hate being visibly wrong. A few days later, my mother asked whether I would come to another family dinner because everyone misses me now. I told her something simple. People usually miss you more after the world proves they underestimated you. A month after the documentary release, I was invited to accept an investigative journalism award in Chicago. And honestly, even reading the email felt surreal because part of me still had not emotionally adjusted to the idea that people inside professional media actually respected my work. For years, journalism existed in my mind as something reserved for people with elite schools, major connections, and institutional support behind them. I was just a woman carrying cameras through abandoned factory towns while editing footage in a tiny apartment after warehouse shifts. Even after the investigation exploded nationally, some insecure part of me still expected someone more qualified to eventually step in and take over the story. That insecurity stayed with me longer than I expected, because when people spend enough years treating your dream like a bad decision, eventually part of you starts feeling guilty whenever reality proves otherwise. I accepted the award invitation anyway. The ceremony became the first moment everything finally felt emotionally real, instead of just chaotic professionally. Journalists, producers, and documentary filmmakers I admired were suddenly introducing themselves to me like I belonged in the same room. Several people mentioned specific scenes from the documentary that stayed with them emotionally, especially interviews with former factory workers describing illnesses and cover-ups nobody cared enough to investigate before. One older investigative reporter pulled me aside during dinner and told me the reason the documentary connected so deeply was because viewers could feel how long I spent earning trust inside those communities before the story became profitable publicly. That compliment mattered more than the award itself because it recognized the exact years my family treated like wasted time. Then came the speech. Originally, I prepared something safe and professional about accountability, investigative persistence, and environmental journalism, But standing on that stage looking out at the audience changed something in me halfway through. I stopped trying to sound polished and started speaking honestly instead. I talked about uncertainty, about how lonely it feels building something nobody around you understands yet. I talked about balancing warehouse shifts with editing until 3 in the morning, while people treated my work like an embarrassing hobby. Then I said the sentence that spread online even faster than the documentary clips themselves. I said the loneliest part of chasing unconventional success is realizing the people closest to you often need proof from strangers before they trust your vision. That clip exploded across social media within hours. Suddenly, my inbox filled with messages from women everywhere describing families who mocked creative careers, parents who pushed daughters toward safe lives instead of meaningful ones, and relatives who only became supportive after success became visible publicly. But the messages that affected me most came from mothers. Not supportive mothers. Regretful ones. Women admitting they discouraged daughters because fear sounded more responsible than belief. That became important a few days later when my mother showed up at my apartment unexpectedly. She looked exhausted in a way I had never seen before. Not dramatic, not performative, just emotionally worn down. For several minutes, neither of us knew how to speak normally because our entire relationship had become tangled inside public attention, old resentment, and rewritten family history. Then she admitted something I genuinely never expected to hear from her. She said watching the interviews and public reaction forced her to realize how often she confused fear with guidance. According to her, every insult, comparison, and humiliating comment came from panic. She grew up watching financial instability destroy people. So to her, unconventional careers looked indistinguishable from self-destruction. She admitted every time she compared me to Liam, she genuinely believed she was trying to push me towards safety, instead of realizing she was slowly teaching me that love inside the family depended on measurable success. I listened quietly because for the first time in my life, she sounded honest without trying to control how she appeared while saying it. Then she admitted the part that hurt most. She said once the documentary succeeded publicly, she realized something humiliating about herself. The daughter she spent years treating like the family embarrassment had more courage than everyone else combined, because I kept building something uncertain while they all stayed emotionally loyal to whatever looked safest socially. That sentence hit harder than any apology she could have given earlier, because it finally sounded real. Not polished. Not rewritten. Real. We talked for almost 3 hours that night, and for the first time in years, it felt like a conversation between two adults instead of a mother managing disappointment. She admitted the family became obsessed with visible success because visible success feels measurable. Safe careers, predictable titles, stable salaries. My path terrified them because there was no guarantee attached to it, and uncertainty made them uncomfortable enough to mistake discouragement for responsibility. Then, she said something that explained my entire childhood perfectly. She told me our family respected outcomes more than process. That was it. That was the whole problem. Nobody cared how hard I worked, because hard work without visible status meant nothing in that environment. The warehouse shifts, sleepless nights, endless interviews, and years of investigation remained invisible because the outcome had not become socially impressive yet. Before leaving, my mother asked whether I thought I could ever forgive the family completely. I told her the truth. Forgiveness is easier than forgetting who believed in you, only after strangers started applauding first. A few weeks later, Liam called and asked if I wanted dinner alone, which honestly shocked me more than national fame ever did, because my brother spent most of his life avoiding emotional conversations entirely. During dinner, he admitted something I never expected. He said part of the reason he stayed silent, while the family criticized me, was because he envied me secretly. At first, I thought he was joking because Liam had the exact life everyone in our family admired. Money, stability, corporate success, respect. But then he explained further. He said I was the only person in the family willing to risk becoming nobody publicly in order to become something meaningful privately. That sentence stayed with me for days because it completely reframed the dynamic between us. Liam was rewarded constantly for certainty, while I was punished constantly for uncertainty. But deep down, he understood the trade-off better than anyone. 6 months after my name first hit the news, the documentary won a major national investigative award. The contamination case expanded federally, multiple executives faced criminal charges, and cleanup funding finally started reaching communities ignored for decades. Professionally, my life transformed completely. I signed long-term production deals, hired a small investigative team, and finally moved out of the tiny apartment my relatives used to mock constantly. But honestly, none of that became the real ending to the story. The real ending happened last week. I was visiting my parents' house for dinner when I overheard my younger cousin Sophie talking nervously in the kitchen about wanting to pursue music production professionally. She sounded terrified about how the family might react. Before I could step into the room, Uncle Victor answered her, and for the first time in my entire life, I heard him say something different. He told her just because a path looks uncertain at first does not mean it is wrong. Then he used me as the example. I stood there quietly for a few seconds, realizing something strange. For years, I thought success would feel satisfying because it proved people wrong. But the real satisfaction came from watching the next girl in the family become a little less afraid to chase something uncertain because of what happened to me. My family called me a failure until the moment the world decided my work mattered publicly. But eventually, I realized their approval was never actually the prize. The real prize was surviving long enough to become the person I was trying to build before anybody clapped for it. Sometimes the people closest to you only support your dream after the rest of the world confirms it was valuable first. Ava's family spent years treating her like an embarrassment because her path looked uncertain, unstable, and socially unimpressive compared to traditional careers. But the moment her work became nationally respected, the same people who mocked her suddenly tried rewriting history to make themselves part of her success story. In the end, the real victory was not the awards, the interviews, or seeing her name on the news. It was realizing she no longer needed approval from people who only respected her after strangers did first. If you were Ava, could you fully forgive your family, or would part of you always remember how they treated you before success arrived? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoy stories about betrayal, underestimated women, and the moment public success exposes private hypocrisy, like and subscribe because the next story might hit even harder.